Hello everyone, welcome back to Geography 101 Earth Systems. Today we're going to be talking all about deserts and desert landscapes. Deserts are definitely important aspects of the natural world. They cover wide swaths of the Earth's surface and they provide nutrients all throughout the world. So knowing where they are and how they are formed is definitely important for knowing about physical geography. So let's start off by talking about where deserts are and what they are. So deserts are dry, barren landscapes that receive less than 25 centimeters or 10 inches of precipitation per year. You can see here on the right the distribution of precipitation throughout the world with all these areas in yellow, orange, and red indicate areas with less than 20 centimeters. So that's a good indication of where the deserts are in our world. We can also plot different areas of aridity based off of humidity. So all the areas indicated here in yellow to red are areas with low average humidity. And you can see areas such as the Sahara and the Arabian Peninsula having some of the lowest aridities or highest aridities, lowest humidities on the planet. So it's important to realize that 3 billion people live in desert regions. So these aren't empty landscapes. These aren't just complete arid, abandoned areas. These are areas where billions of people depend on in order to live. And that includes nearly 200 million people in North America. And as population increases, that number is only going to increase as well, with the number of people living in arid to semi-arid regions increasing by millions, hundreds of millions of people by 2050. And you can see that different continents will be receiving more and more population increases. So that's definitely important if we're to think about the context of climate change, that more and more people are going to be exposed to these areas that are going to be rapidly warming and receiving less precipitation. So that's definitely a cause for concern. We can see here these are the 10 largest deserts in the world, ranked in terms of size. And the two largest deserts are Antarctica and the Arctic. So that might be surprising to people. So Antarctica is particularly low in precipitation because it's so cold. Precipitation tends to happen when you have a lot of evaporation, and evaporation only happens when you have high temperatures. Additionally, that Antarctic circumpolar current that goes around the Antarctic continent tends to block some of those clouds that would cause more precipitation in the area. So both the Arctic and the Antarctic tend to have very low amounts of precipitation, and they represent the largest deserts on Earth. That's followed by the Sahara Desert in northern Africa, the Arabian Desert, and the Gobi Desert in Asia. So deserts are distributed all over the planet, and they tend to have very different characteristics. So these are pictures that I took when I was working in Antarctica. This is the McMurdo Dry Valleys. So the dry valleys are an area of Antarctica where there's so little precipitation that glaciers can't even form. And instead, it's just a barren landscape of rock and soil. And so this is just an example of what a cold desert might look like. All of Antarctica receives very little precipitation, but as you receive even less precipitation, even glaciers can't form there, and you're just left with a very Martian-like environment. So one of the reasons why deserts are something to really consider is that they're expanding. And this process of expansion of deserts as fertile land becomes desert is known as desertification. And you can see here, this is a time lapse switching from 1984 to 2019, where you can see this area in the southern Sahara extending its desert region, as well as in the north here, and as well in this region. And so desertification is definitely a process that's very active right now as different areas get warmer and drier. So we can use climate models in order to actually predict which areas are the most vulnerable to desertification. And that's based off of changes in precipitation and humidity and expected evaporation rates. And the areas that are most vulnerable are the Middle East, as well as the southern states of the United States, as well as large areas around the Sahara and Australia. So these areas, very likely with climate change, will be getting more and more arid as time goes on. We can use climate models to map out different scenarios as well. And so here we see a map of the percent change in the precipitation divided by the evapotranspiration rate. And so that gives an idea of whether an area is losing water or gaining water, with areas in red losing water to evaporation faster than they're gaining it due to precipitation. And here we can see these are the predicted results for an RCP 8.5, where you see huge swaths of South America as well as Africa and the Mediterranean having huge decreases in precipitation and water loss as we go into the turn of the century. If we zoom in on different areas, we can see that Africa, for example, is expected to get significantly more arid under an RCP 8.5. That's a business as usual scenario compared to an RCP 4.5, where you have significantly less aridity. And so reducing our carbon emissions and keeping the temperature to 2 degrees Celsius will cause these areas to suffer significantly less due to water stress. If we look at the United States, the Southwest, the picture looks significantly different whether we're in a low emission scenario than in a high emission scenario, with a high emission scenario having pretty much entire states with over 30% change in precipitation rate compared to maybe 10% under a low emission scenario. And so that's a very significant loss in precipitation in an area that already is water stressed. The temperature also is likely to be significantly different depending on our emission scenario. We can see in 2090, the climate models predict that under a low emission scenario, the southwest of the United States is expected to gain around 5 degrees Celsius. That's compared to around 9 degrees, Fahrenheit, 5 degrees Fahrenheit, compared to around 9 degrees Fahrenheit under a high emission scenario. And that increase of 4 degrees Fahrenheit just based off of our emission scenario means that there's going to be significantly more deaths from heat stroke, decreases in crop yield, and just an overall worse scenario for the United States. We can see here, this is a map that's showing the change in vegetation cover. It's showing NDVI, which is a remote sensing term for how green an area is. And we see that changes in the greenness of the planet due to climate are widespread. So you can see areas of the American Western states, as well as South America and areas of China experiencing significant decreases in the amount of greenness just due to climate. And that's all on top of changes in vegetation due to land use changes such as deforestation or urbanization, stuff like that. Desertification is a positive feedback loop too. And so the more desertification that we have, the worse the problem gets. So you can look at this chart to get an idea of that. So for example, if we have increasing amounts of climate change, we have increases in the amount of extreme weather events such as floods, droughts, and wildfires. And that in turn causes more soil erosion, and that releases the carbon dioxide that's stored in that organic matter in the soil, and therefore that carbon dioxide is released into the atmosphere, causing even more climate change. Additionally, that soil erosion causes a loss of nutrients in the soil, which causes a biodiversity loss, and reduce soil quality, which can result in even more soil erosion. And so there's multiple different processes that are going on here with that biodiversity loss going to cause even more desertification and therefore less ability for the soil to absorb carbon and further leading to climate change. So this is kind of a vicious circle that goes on in which more desertification can lead to even faster rates of desertification. So it's something that we really have to look out for and make sure that we're not exacerbating the process. So let's talk about some of the geographic features that make up deserts. So the first that we're going to talk about are ergs. So ergs are the deserts that you might see in a movie. They're the seas of expansive, unconsolidated sand that form these large dune areas, not quite the ergs that you might see in a gym. But ergs make up a significant portion of desert areas within outside of polar regions. So within the Sierra, they cover about 20% of the Sahara. You can see all of the different ergs that are present in yellow. And so ergs require a good amount of sand to sustain. Usually that sand comes from a mountain range or a floodplain that has that sand blow into a valley region where you can have a large dune field, such as this. The next type of feature in landscape that we're going to talk about is regs. So regs are arid regions covered by both sand and gravel. You can see a reg here with some boulders and rocks that are scattered within the sand field. So regs make up the majority of the Sahara and areas with sand deserts, and they're also the region where you get desert pavement that we talked about previously in our erosion slides. So if you remember, desert pavement is formed as the wind blows away the sand and leaves behind these larger rocks and boulders. And as that happens, you have deflation and a consolidation of these gravel and boulders at the surface. Additionally, a lot of times when you have desert pavement that develops, you also have desert varnish. So a lot of the rocks that form that desert pavement tend to be a darker color than the rocks beneath them. And that's because as wind blows over the surface, a lot of minerals and debris is caught up in that wind, one of them being manganese oxide. And when that manganese oxide hits a rock, it can stick to it. That's further exacerbated when you have like bits of grease or other soot that also can glom onto a rock. You can see here this is a picture that I took from Capitol Reef National Park, where you had manganese oxide dissolved in some of the water that was dripping over the rocks, depositing these black stains on the rock. And so a lot of times when you have exposed rock in the desert, it can get kind of a dark hue that we call desert varnish. The next type of landscape that we're going to talk about is Hamadas. So Hamadas are regions of deserts where you have exposed bedrock. So this is a photo that I took from the Valley of Fire near Las Vegas, as well as the Valley of Gods near Monument Valley, where you have large open areas that have also bedrock that's exposed at the surface. So next we're going to be talking about dunes. Dunes are the characteristic feature of deserts, and they form pretty much wherever you have large expanses of ergs or sand in a region. And there's multiple different types of dunes, and they're all basically formed by the same process. Wind flowing over a sandy area, and you have wind being transported from the windward side over a hill slope and then deposited on the slip face. And so that slip face tends to be at the angle of repose. That's if you were to just have a pile of sand fall down, what angle that pile would be at would be the angle of repose, and it's usually around 34 degrees. And so as that wind picks up sand from the windward side and deposits it on the slip face, you have erosion that goes on. So the sand is picked up here and deposited here, and as a result, the dune moves downwind over time. So the type of dune that forms, it can be a variety of different shapes, and the shape is defined by the amount of sand that's applied to that dune field, the wind speed and the consistency of that wind, as well as the vegetation cover. So for example, if you have a dune field that has very high wind but not a large sand supply, you'll get longitudinal dunes, whereas an area with lower wind and more sand supply, you would get transverse dunes. And we'll go into each of these different types of dunes. So first we'll talk about dunes that are formed from unidirectional wind. That's wind that's coming from one direction. And the first type are dome-shaped dunes. They tend to form whenever you have a pile of sand that builds up that's not exposed to that extensive of wind, and so it's not being blown or shaped in any way to be more aerodynamic. You can see an example of a dome dune here, and so it's basically just a pile of sand that's exposed to only a small amount of wind. The next type of dune that we have are transverse ridges, transverse dunes. And these are fairly linear dunes that run perpendicular to the wind direction. You can see here these dunes here are perpendicular to this wind direction here. And here's an example of transverse ridges here. And these form just like I was talking about before, where you have wind blowing over the windward side and then getting that sand being deposited on the leeward slip side of the dune. But the wind is not large enough to kind of separate these dunes apart, and they're still able to kind of act like it's one sheet of wind blowing over the entire region. So transverse dunes can happen on a variety of different scales. You can see these transverse dunes that are very small in scale, just happening on the surface of another dune. But also you can see this entire mountain range here, this dune field, that has these really gigantic transverse dunes that have developed. The next type of dune that we're going to talk about are barchan dunes. So these are maybe the most characteristic dunes that you might see in a movie or something like that. So these are the curved dunes that form from slightly stronger unidirectional wind. And the important thing about barchan dunes is that the crest of that curve is always pointing upwind. The arms are pointing downwind. And so they have this curved shape that always has this relation to the wind. So in this case, the wind would be flowing from here over this way. And so you can kind of think of these as transverse dunes where the arms have been blown hard enough to get pushed back and towards the wind direction here. And so just like other dunes, you have a gently sloping windward side and a stronger sloping lee side where you have that angle of repose coming in as well. You can see an example of some barchan dunes here. You could tell from both the fact that the ocean is in this direction, but also from the shape of the barchan dunes, that this wind must be flowing from top down as it moves across the landscape, forming these dune formations like this. Next, when we get even stronger wind speeds, we can get parabolic dunes. So these are barchan dunes that have been completely shifted around. And so the parabolic dunes will have the curve or the U shape facing upwind instead of downwind like barchan dunes. You can kind of think of these as dunes that are exposed to so much wind that the middle of the dune is just blown through the arms and pushed very quickly downwind. And so you have this characteristic U shape with the crest pointing downwind and the arms pointing upwind. Here's an example of those where you have the strong wind coming from this region and blowing these dunes this way. Here's another example of an entire dune field of parabolic dunes. So the next type of dunes are longitudinal ridges, and these initially look very similar to transverse ridges, but instead of transverse ridges that form perpendicular to the wind direction, longitudinal ridges form parallel to the wind direction. So you can see here the wind is moving in this direction from bottom left to top right and kind of converging together. And as those winds converge, they can form a longitudinal ridge as all the sand is pushed into one direction. And so in this case, you would have the wind going this way, or it looks like this way, or it could go in this direction as well. The next type of dune we have are star dunes. So star dunes are really gorgeous type of dune in which the wind is moving in multiple directions. So you have the wind shifting maybe from this direction at one point to this direction, to this direction, to this direction. And the result is you kind of have multiple dunes stacked on top of each other. And you have multiple arms that extend out from a single point like this one. So the wind is coming from the direction between the arms, and you can have multiple arms depending on how many predominant wind directions there are for that area. Next, we have blowout dunes. These are less common, but whenever you have a dust devil or a circulating wind pattern, you can have the sand in that area get blown out, and the result is a concave hole in the ground that we know as a blowout dune. Next, we have reversing dunes. So a reversing dune is similar to a transverse dune. The as well as kind of like a star dune, on which it's kind of you have a ridge that develops just like a transverse ridge, but then you all of a sudden have the wind switch direction and flow in the opposite direction. And so first you have this normal transverse ridge that forms, and then the wind switches, and so you kind of have this crest develop and forming this ridge like this, where it's not at the angle of repose anymore. Instead, it has this more wave-like shape to it. And then the last type of dune that we're going to talk about are Nebka or caprice dunes, and these are dunes formed from vegetation cover that covers a sandy area and holds the sand in place. So these dunes don't move very quickly like the other types of dunes because they're kind of stationary due to the plant life, but it's a good way to build up a dune as plants tend to trap a lot of sand, and you can have the dune form in that way. All right, so it wouldn't be a proper New Jersey Rutgers lecture talking about dunes without also talking about coastal dunes. Coastal dunes are a vital part of our landscapes here in New Jersey, and so we're going to talk about them in the next video. We'll take a break here and we'll come back and talk about coastal dune formation and their morphology. All right, I'll see you guys soon.